In a lonely grave, forgotten and unknown, lies the man who saved a president, and who, as a result, may well have preserved for ourselves and posterity constitutional government in the United States.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
In 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring that all escaped slaves be returned to their masters. Anyone refusing to cooperate did so under pain of imprisonment. Abolitionists nicknamed it the Bloodhound Law. 2 years later, a runaway slave from Missouri named Joshua Glover escaped to Racine, Wisconsin, but he was soon arrested, beaten, and jailed by federal marshals. A young man named Edmund Ross joined a group of local citizens who stormed the jail, freed Glover, and sent him on his way to Canada. This was Ross's first public act as an abolitionist. Throughout his life, he was a man of conscience and a man of principle. In a few short years, he would perform an act as a U.S. senator that would save a president and preserve the nation's system of government. Nearly a century later, he would be featured in President John F. Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize-winning Profiles in Courage.
When you talk about political courage, you mean somebody who's willing to go against the wishes of his constituents for what he considers the best interests of the country. Now, obviously, if you're going to have political courage, you have to take the consequences, and Ross did. Ross made a great contribution to our system and at his own personal loss.
With some states already threatening to secede from the Union, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
The original legislation that became the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been introduced over the winter of 1853-1854. And David Atchison, the senator from Missouri, made it clear to Stephen Douglas, who was chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, that this legislation was going nowhere as long as it contained a prohibition on slavery in the new territories. So Douglas reintroduced the legislation and replaced it with something called popular sovereignty. And they basically rammed it through Congress. Popular sovereignty meant that the settlers would decide whether or not to have slavery in the territory. Southerners were delighted. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a gift. They had been shut out of the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, and now they were getting something, access to that territory that they had not expected to get. Missourians in particular were right across the river. Everybody assumed that they would control the territory and that Kansas was going to be slave. Northerners were outraged. They had been blocked from settling that territory because it hadn't been organized, but it was supposed to be free territory.
The backlash in the North inspired the formation of the New England Immigrant Aid Company that promoted moving as many anti-slavery people as possible to the territory of Kansas. Hundreds responded.
Most of us have come to this faraway land with a mission in our hearts, a mission to the dark-browed race, and hoping here to stay the surging tide of slavery.
By May of 1856, Edmund and his wife Fanny, who had 3 children by now, were able to make the trip to Kansas. For Edmund, it was a major episode because he would lead an entire wagon train of like-minded people to Kansas. The trip took 88 days through uncharted terrain, always avoiding hostile Missouri, which was a slave state.
Many other travelers joined our caravan for protection. I remember Mother holding me over the side of the wagon that I might look toward the rear of the train. It was a mile long.
The struggle for a free Kansas was a holy war for abolitionists. For the Ross family, slavery was immoral. They didn't want it in Kansas, and they didn't want it anywhere. They hoped that within their lifetime they could see freedom and opportunity for slaves under the law. They were willing to sacrifice to leave a comfortable lifestyle and travel west to fight for it.
We would gather on a knoll about sunset with songbooks, never omitting Whittier's hymn, The Song of Kansas Immigrants.
We go to hear a wall of men on freedom's southern line, and plant beside the cotton tree the rugged northern pine, a berry like the ark of old, a Bible in our van. We go to test the truth of God against the fraud of man.
The people of the Kansas Territory endured a bloody summer as the wagon train wound its way to Topeka.
When Northern settlers came into Kansas Territory, they believed that popular sovereignty was real. They believed that they were going to have a choice at the ballot box about whether or not they would have slavery. And they were roundly disillusioned. The most important of the early elections was the spring of 1855. It was an election for the territorial legislature. And Missourians crossed over the river in droves, and they were armed, and they were drunk and rowdy. And so when New Englanders and Midwesterners showed up to vote at those first elections, they were warned away from the polls. And then the Missourians took over the ballot box and dropped in their ballots. So the result of the first election was that although the territorial census had shown there were slightly fewer than 3,000 eligible voters in the territory, pro-slavery candidates to the legislature got elected with majorities of 5,000 and 6,000 votes. Northerners cried fraud, and they broke away and they set up their own free soil, free state government.
In a matter of days, Edmund Ross joined the Kansas Free State Army as a volunteer, carrying a musket as a private soldier. He fought in the Battle of Hickory Point against pro-slavery forces from Missouri.
By summer of 1855, you have two different governments in Kansas Territory. There were a number of clashes between the Free Staters and the pro-slavery territorial government. Lawrence was the principal New England settlement. If you were a Missourian, Lawrence was what you called an abolition hellhole. Missourians proceeded to loot the town, and this will be called the sack of Lawrence.
The abolitionist John Brown and his band of radicals dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their homes along Pottawatomie Creek and murdered them by gunshot or hacked them to death with swords.
They carried them into a neighboring cabin and, with threats of instant death, ordered them to leave Kansas. Damn you. If you are ever caught here again, you shall be strung up. Go to Nebraska, damn you. You have no right in Kansas.
Guerrilla warfare ensued. Travel was dangerous, and many residents slept with loaded weapons, terrified of highway robbery and murder, including the looting and burning of homes.
These are the matches that set off the latent tension that existed in Kansas Territory ever since the first elections, and that's the epoch that we speak of as Bleeding Kansas.
It was into this cauldron that Edmund Ross brought his family in August of 1856.
The town of Topeka itself was something of a disappointment. No walks, no trees, nor to my childish mind was there anything lovely or desirable.
By late 1856, Edmund Ross and his brother William would begin to fight their battles with words. They purchased the Kansas Tribune and launched their first issue as co-editors, their editorials always dealing with Free State issues. They were becoming important leaders in the Free State movement.
The destiny of the entire domain of the United States west of the Mississippi River hangs upon the question of slavery in Kansas.
One day, Ross's daughter Lillian displayed the family's abolitionist spirit during an incident at their home.
A mulatto came from around the corner of the house and asked, "Does Mr. Ross live here?" I was only 8 years of age, but fully understood the penalty attached to helping the Negro if discovered.
Lillian took the runaway inside the house and kept him there. When her parents came home, Edmund arranged to get the man to a safe house owned by Colonel John Ritchie, who directed the man to Canada. Meanwhile, the battle between pro- and anti-slavery forces had taken on a new dimension, moving from violent confrontation to a battle of wills over whose proposed state constitution would prevail in the U.S. Congress and whose representatives would run the state government. The Rosses blasted the absurdity of Kansas entering the Union as a slave state.
That is not what the people want. It is something they will not have. It is resolved into the simply absurd proposition that wrong must be done, that a wrong may be undone.
In June 1859, Ross was elected as a delegate to the Wyandotte Constitutional Convention. Because Republicans dominated the convention, Kansas was easily made free.
That same year, there were severe drought conditions and even famine in the territory. Edmund helped start a territorial relief convention, and then along with Cyrus Holliday and others, promoted rail service connecting east to Chicago and west to California. Their efforts resulted in the establishment of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad.
Kansas officially became a state on January 29, 1861. Had it not been for the stubborn and dramatic resistance of the Free State Party and its leaders, especially men like Edmund Ross and his brother, and their willingness to fight and even die for the cause, Kansas could not have been admitted to the Union as a free state. It wouldn't take much more to cause southern states to secede from the Union, considering the forthcoming election of Abraham Lincoln. In a real sense, the Civil War had already begun in Kansas.
Oh, we'll rally round the flagpoles, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry.
Perhaps at another time in history, celebrations of statehood would have spilled into the streets of towns throughout Kansas. A month earlier, however, South Carolina had seceded from the Union. And when Kansas was declared a free state by the U.S. Congress, it moved the country closer to a civil war. In a matter of weeks, Abraham Lincoln would be inaugurated. Edmund Ross believed that the slave states of Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri could be reasoned with, and convinced not to secede.
There are measures of compromise which we have every reason to believe would be satisfactory to the great body of the people of the South.
But by the firing on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, a total of 7 states had left the Union. After April, 4 more seceded.
We need relief from the impending calamity, the shadow of which has for months past darkened the prospects of our country. History has demonstrated the proverb that the hour will always produce its man.
Throughout that summer, Ross's hopes were dashed as he learned of more and more horrendous losses of life, including many people he knew.
In the early months of 1862, there was profound sadness for Edmund and Fanny. Their 3.5-year-old son, Flint, succumbed to diphtheria. The Rosses were brokenhearted as they buried Flint on top of a hill east of Topeka. The memory of that child buried there by himself would haunt them for the rest of their lives.
With the Civil War going poorly, the president issued a national call for 300,000 volunteers. Edmund Ross was 35 years old, and although he had a large family to care for and a business to run, he issued a call to action through his newspaper.
Enlistment has become the duty of every man who is capable of bearing arms. His duty to his wife and little ones requires him to meet the enemy far off and keep them from his door.
Ross then bade farewell to Fanny and the 4 children. All of the men who made up the 11th had hopes that the time away from their families would be short. But that was not to be. They would be gone for 3 years, and some would not return at all. Captain Ross was asked to raise a company and recruited 67 men from the Topeka area. Ross wrote his wife Fanny about the dangers ahead.
In case of my death, I have made arrangements by which you will be entirely protected. That done, I shall have no good reason for hesitancy on the battlefield.
Oh, we'll rally round the flag.
The first serious battle experienced by Ross and his regiment was the Battle of Cane Hill, Arkansas, where 5,000 Union soldiers faced 8,000 Confederate cavalry. After a forced march of 27 hours over 38 miles of rough terrain,
All along the road during the pursuit were scattered dead and wounded men and horses, marking spots that were hotly contested.
the Battle of Prairie Grove was fought throughout the day and into the darkness on December 7th. Captain Ross's Company E supported the 2nd Indiana Battery opposite the center of the Confederate line where the rebel firepower was the heaviest. Ross's men fired from a prone position with the cannons firing over them.
When I think of the time we were engaged and the way the balls flew around us, it looks almost like a miracle that we were not cut to pieces. All that saved us was laying flat on the ground, and they shot over us.
Despite the horrors, Ross's regiment had marched, hiked, climbed, and waded their way through difficult terrain. At a camp near Springfield, Missouri, a measles outbreak spread quickly and took many lives. The place came to be known as the Valley of the Shadow of Death. As many as 300 men of the 11th were sadly gone by this time. As the Civil War ground toward its grisly end, the 2nd Brigade battled Confederate forces in Missouri at a river known as the Little Blue. Although they ran out of ammunition, Ross's men had mounted a superb stand on the west bank of the river. He is reported to have had 2 horses shot out from beneath him.
I had seen him on the field of battle amid shot and shell that tried men's souls, and I knew he could be trusted.
Captain Ross's Company E was sent to Lawrence, Kansas, for protection against roving bands of rebel guerrillas. After some citizens complained about the boisterousness of the troops, General Ewing reassigned them to patrol duty along the Missouri-Kansas border. That fateful decision set the stage for one of the darkest moments in the Civil War.
Lawrence has always been the center of abolitionist activity. Slaves who are running away from Missouri know to run to Lawrence because that's where you're most likely to find sympathetic people who will aid you. A lot of young men from good slave-owning families ended up taking to the bush. They come to be called bushwhackers or guerrillas. These are people like Frank and Jesse James, like Cole Younger. They're guerrillas. They're hiding out in the woods. They're attacking Union outposts. They're attacking reconnaissance parties of Union soldiers. They're being aided by their womenfolk who are in the civilian population. William Quantrell becomes leader of one of these bushwhacking bands filled with a lot of Southerners. By the summer of 1863, the Union military officials in Missouri thought that one of the ways they could deal with these bushwhacking bands was to jail the women. And they arrested a number of female relatives, sisters mostly, of the bushwhackers, and some of them were held in a jail in Kansas City. And the building collapsed. In the summer of 1863, some of the young women were killed, some were horribly mangled and crippled by the building collapse. A lot of Missourians thought then, and still insist today, that the Union officials had deliberately put these young women in an unsafe building, and it was an outrage. So Quantrill has a grudge against Lawrence because he had not gotten along with the Free Staters when he was living in Kansas Territory. A lot of his men have a grudge against the Union officials. They hit Lawrence about dawn, pretty much if you were an adult man in Lawrence. And for the bushwhackers, adult man could mean 12, 13 years old. They set fire to houses. They shot men down. Women threw themselves in front of their husbands, and a bushwhacker might push her out of the way and just put a bullet in her husband right in front of her. There was a newly enlisted unit of black troops in Lawrence who were hit by the bushwhackers right at the beginning of the raid and who were decimated. And there was so much anger among Missourians at slaves running away. That black encampment was a particular target for the bushwhackers. When Quantrill's raiders left town, they left it ablaze. They had killed an estimated 150 men and boys. Some bodies were never found because the bushwhackers had set so many buildings on fire. There are corpses afterward that are burned up and can't be identified. One of the saddest stories to me is the Spear family. John Spear, who was a newspaper editor, and certainly he was targeted by the Missourians. One of the Spear sons never came home and probably was burned up in one of the buildings. And his mother, for the rest of her life, always set a place at dinner because she was convinced that her boy would come home.
When Johnny come marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah.
2 years later, at the end of the war, Lillian described her father's return to Lawrence.
Toward evening, one gray day, came my father, walking and leading his horse.
Ross mustered out of the Union Army as a major in August 1865, after 3 years. All he wanted to do now was return to his family, operate a printing business, and publish his own newspaper. But he had no money and barely had a home he could call his own. In a letter to his wife, he said,
"I am afraid we shall have to sell our horses in order to pay for the house. You had better see Johnson and tell him how it is, and tell him you will sell the mares if you can, for it will be impossible to pay him as soon as I had promised."
In August 1865, the Kansas Tribune published The Negro Question, which criticized any plan for former slaves that did not include full rights of citizenship.
What manner of men were those who in their hour of extremity called to their assistance this race of people, and when their country was saved, lacked the courage and generosity to grant them the rights their blood paid for?
Edmund Ross advocated suffrage for freed slaves as their most important weapon of self-defense. One of his early editorials was a commentary on reports out of the South that not much was changing.
The legislature of Alabama, which, while it affects to comply with the amendment of the Constitution abolishing slavery, yet enacts in its laws a more terrible and barbarous slave code than was ever known in the United States before.
In the meantime, a deep chasm was unfolding in Washington between President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, and a radical Congress. It was a chasm into which Edmund G. Ross was soon to fall. Before his assassination, President Lincoln convened a cabinet meeting to address restoration of the Southern states to their previous status in the Union. Lincoln had intended that with certain conditions, the seceded states could have their constitutional rights restored. But radical Republicans in the legislature believed that by losing the war, they had forfeited any rights and had simply become territories. In the spring of 1865, a terrible pall was cast over the nation as word spread that President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated.
On the 21st of April, 1865, 3:31 left Washington for Lincoln's last train ride. Cannons boomed, bonfires burned, the evergreens wore crepe. 3:31 in the morning sun did her sad journey make. See that train coming, boys, rolling down the main. Draped in black, she won't be back, it's Lincoln's funeral train.
When Andrew Johnson assumed office after the assassination of President Lincoln, many radicals actually expected that he would take a stronger stand against the South. Johnson came up with his own plan for Reconstruction that required particularly wealthy Southern planters to personally ask for a pardon for having favored the Confederacy.
On May 29th, Johnson declared rebel authority null and void and granted blanket amnesty to the vast majority of Confederates whose property was worth less than $20,000. Some in Congress saw these pardons as Johnson's attempt to acquire Southern support for his own future political aspirations.
Many Republicans were shocked when Andrew Johnson began vetoing congressional legislation, including one which was to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency created by Congress to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom in the South.
Johnson was a Southerner, a Democrat, and a former slave owner who believed blacks were inferior to whites and were better off as slaves. Opponents believed the measure usurped the authority of the civil government set up under Johnson's Reconstruction program. And in reaction to continuing reports of cruelty to blacks in the South, a voice was heard from Kansas.
It is unfortunate for President Johnson and for the country that he has chosen to defeat this important measure. He proposes to leave the freedmen where they substantially are, subject to the tender mercies of the rebel populace and militia of the South.
The most serious split between the president and the majority of Republicans came in the early spring when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, guaranteeing citizenship to persons born in the United States, except Native Americans. Again, President Johnson vetoed the bill, arguing that it violated the rights of states to decide citizenship.
Johnson believed that the measure was in essence unconstitutional because it had been the states traditionally that determined who was a citizen and what rights citizens should have. This measure was so important to the Republicans that they then passed it over Johnson's veto and enshrined its key measures in the 14th Amendment, putting it beyond the reach of the president.
Ross organized a group of prominent men in Lawrence to condemn the Reconstruction policies of President Andrew Johnson. By speaking up, what mattered to Ross was that he do the right thing. In just 2 years, that same mindset would lead to the most crucial public decision he would ever face, a decision that would dramatically affect his life and the history of the country.
At the end of the war, Colonel Samuel Crawford, the man who had observed Ross in battle, became governor of Kansas. When long-serving Kansas Senator Jim Lane took his own life in July of 1866, Crawford was faced with a dilemma in filling the vacant seat. 4 prominent statesmen, among many others, sought the appointment, but the governor selected Ross.
Ross himself had recommended another man, but I knew him to be an honest, straightforward soldier of sterling worth and unflinching courage.
And so Edmund Ross, a man without political experience, now embarked on his new role as a member of the United States Senate, a challenge which no doubt energized him, but would also keep him from his family for long periods of time.
At the close of the war, we had thought we would not be left alone again. We had but one winter together, but we could not be with him. The children must be in school and the home cared for. So Mother still watched over her boys, alone.
Ross had no idea what to expect in Washington. It was unlike anything he had experienced in the remoteness of Kansas. As he moved along Pennsylvania Avenue, lined with a myriad of businesses and hotels, the sidewalks thick with pedestrians dressed in unfamiliar styles, he must have felt like a stranger in a foreign country. Walking through the Capitol building with its rotunda rising more than 180 feet from the floor, and with its frescoed walls and historic statues, surely prompted the newly minted senator to wonder how on earth he had arrived in such a place. As the United States Senate addressed the vexing issue of Reconstruction after the Civil War, its most junior member, Edmund G. Ross, rose to give his very first speech.
We have with us the widowed and orphaned ones of this war. Remember that it was by this great affliction that this country was saved, that they stood in the breach of the Republic and her foes, and we will be true to them.
By the time Ross spoke in the name of the Union's martyrs, the confrontation between Andrew Johnson and the Republicans was already coming to a head. This unity between the radical and moderate factions of the Republican Party would lead to a series of historic compromises that would extend voting rights to African American men in the South. Among the many measures to come out of this were the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867, truly remarkable measures that in essence said that the former Confederate states would be ruled by the military until they could accept a number of much more dramatic conditions laid out by congressional Republicans. The Military Reconstruction Acts required, among other things, that the Southern states sit down and rewrite their constitutions again, but this time that they allow African American men to participate in that process as voters and delegates. The Southern states, which were still led mostly by former Confederates, then deeply offended much of Northern public opinion by passing a series of laws that were known as Black Codes. These laws, in many cases, acknowledged the end of slavery, but then went about to directly recreate conditions that were very similar to slavery.
Oh, freedom.
Blacks may not vote, witness against a white man, own property or a gun, hold public office, marry a white person, serve on juries, attend school, own or rent a farm, join a militia, use offensive language, leave a state without permission, or gather after sunset. Blacks must be gainfully employed, carry a pass to travel, use separate facilities, become farmers or servants, and secure permission to change jobs.
Now, Mr. Speaker, unless Congress proceeds at once to do something to protect these people from the barbarians that are now daily murdering them, I ask you and every man who loves liberty whether we will not be liable for the just censure of the world for negligence or cowardice.
Senator Ross's eloquent December 20th speech included a resolution unanimously passed calling on Congress to take control of Reconstruction from President Johnson.
It was, in a sense, Johnson's miscalculation, along with the Black Codes, that allowed more moderate and radical Republicans to come together to decide that they needed to take much more drastic action and assert control over the Reconstruction process. The aim of the congressional Republicans was to limit the ability of Johnson to remove civil officials, including cabinet officials, without the consent of the Senate. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War under Abraham Lincoln, became a serious thorn in Johnson's side. Ultimately, Andrew Johnson decided to fire Stanton. By this point in Johnson's administration, he had been in opposition to Republican policies for well over a year, and bitterness on both sides was very, very deep. Johnson's decision to fire Stanton was in many ways what pushed Republicans to impeach him and put him on trial in the Senate.
The Tenure of Office Act was passed in 1867 over a veto by President Johnson. The act was intended to prevent the removal of civil officers without the consent of Congress. When Johnson proceeded to terminate Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, the Senate initiated 11 impeachment charges. Among them, President Johnson conspired to unlawfully curtail faithful execution of the Tenure of Office Act in dismissing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The President appointed General Lorenzo Thomas to this post without Senate advice and consent. The President violated federal law requiring all military orders to be issued through the General of the Army. The President granted General Thomas authority to seize and control disbursements of the monies appropriated for military service and for the Department of War. The President has fostered disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach toward the Congress of the United States and the Presidency. Chief Justice Salmon Chase presided at the trial, with all 54 members of the Senate sitting as jurors. The Constitution required a two-thirds vote of the Senate to expel the President. It would take a vote of 36, with Republicans easily in control, with 41 members of the Senate.
During the trial, which lasted most of April, there were 7 Republicans who seemed to be uncertain about conviction, including Edmund Ross. On May 11th, at a Republican caucus, 6 of the 7 declared they would not vote for conviction on any of the 11 articles of impeachment. Ross refused to say how he would vote. He knew the consequences of voting to acquit. It was made abundantly clear to him by Republicans in Washington and by constituents in Kansas that he would never be reelected to the Senate if he voted to acquit.
The radicals were outraged that a senator from such an anti-Johnson stronghold as Kansas could be doubtful. Republicans believed Ross's vote was rightfully theirs, and they were determined to get it by whatever means available. Ross was warned by his colleagues that a vote for acquittal of the president would mean his political death. Heavy pressure was brought against him by important figures in Kansas demanding that he vote to impeach. He answered them all in a telegram to D.R. Anthony, a Kansas publisher who had demanded that he vote to impeach the president.
I do not recognize your right to demand that I shall vote for or against conviction. I have taken an oath to do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, and trust that I shall have the courage and the honesty to vote according to the dictates of my judgment and for the highest good of the country.
The galleries were packed. General admission tickets were sold out. The House had adjourned and all of its members were in the Senate chamber. Every chair on the Senate floor was occupied. Dozens of reporters were filling their notebooks.
I looked down into my open grave. Friendships, position, fortune, everything that makes life desirable to an ambitious man were about to be swept away by the breath of my mouth.
A death-like stillness then enveloped the chamber. As the voting unfolded, only Ross's vote was needed to obtain the 36 votes necessary to convict the president and remove him from the White House. But no one knew how this young Kansan would vote.
Mr. Senator Ross, how say you?
In the chamber, a young journalist who would later be known as Mark Twain reported on the impeachment drama for the nation.
The prodigious words had something so solemn and so awe-inspiring about them that people seemed inclined to think the unexpected thunderclap was about to crash above the pictured ceiling.
Ross's first response was not heard by some in the chamber. Then came the answer again, in a voice that could not be misunderstood.
Not guilty.
The deed was done. The president saved. The trial as good as over, and the conviction lost.
On this article, 35 senators having voted guilty and 19 not guilty, a two-thirds majority not having voted for conviction, the president is therefore acquitted.
In a large sense, the independence of the executive office as a coordinate branch of the government was on trial. If the president must step down, a disgraced man and a political outcast, upon insufficient proofs and from partisan considerations, the office of the president would be degraded and ever after subordinated to the legislative will.
In a letter to his wife, Ross wrote,
"Millions of men cursing me today will bless me tomorrow for having saved the country from the greatest peril through which it has ever passed, though none but God can ever know the struggle it has cost me."
He thought the grounds for impeachment were inadequately drawn, and therefore that it was unconstitutional. So if you're going to have political courage, you have to take the consequences, and Ross did. Neither Ross nor the other 6 Republicans who voted against the impeachment of Andrew Johnson of the opposite political party were ever returned to the Senate again. Ross lived in humiliation and disgrace for the rest of his term. He was beaten up physically.
Patronage and influence peddling were the currency of governance in Washington during those years, even within the Lincoln administration. In the aftermath of the impeachment trial, charges of outright bribery were rampant throughout Kansas and much of the country. Some charged that Ross and the others had sold their votes for greenbacks. But there is no tangible evidence to support such charges. It is true that Ross recommended several appointments to the president, but it was common for senators to do so.
Contrary to the charges he had pocketed greenbacks, Ross's letters to Fanny in the years that followed reveal the family's ongoing financial stress, considering the sale of their family home, having their sons get paying jobs, planting a garden to lower food costs, and postponing tuition payments for Lillian. Nevertheless, he looked on the bright side, writing, "We are all young and strong, and the world is yet before us."
In his final 2 years in the Senate, Ross argued urgently for the passage of the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act.
Slavery is not dead until all its supports are removed. It will never die until the Negro is placed in a position of political equality. Without the ballot, he is the slave of public prejudice and public caprice.
The Voting Rights Act was ratified by the states 1 year later. When Ross's tumultuous years in the Senate came to an end, his daughter described his long-awaited homecoming.
Mother had warned that the carriage might be hit with rotten eggs on his arrival, but this time we brought him home very quietly. So, after a long absence, we were again united.
After Ross left the Senate, he returned to Kansas and attempted to secure a job as a journalist. However, most of the newspapers in the state were owned and operated by Republicans, and no one would hire him because of his acquittal vote. Ross's solution was to start his own newspaper in Coffeyville. He purchased a small building and the needed equipment, publishing his first edition in December 1871. Unfortunately, a few months later, a tornado tore through the area, utterly destroying Ross's building. His own words best describe the incident. Even the elements of the air seemed to have it in for me. The cyclone struck me and scattered my building and printing office and material for miles over the prairie, leaving me stunned and bruised on the ground, a considerable distance from where my building had stood, and my last dollar gone. Ross had apparently stayed in touch with former Kansans who had settled in New Mexico. They described it as a place with a bright future. And so one of the founders of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad boarded the train and headed west.
When Edmund Ross stepped off the train in the territory of New Mexico, he discovered in Albuquerque the quintessential Wild West, a town with rough edges but great promise. Ross quickly took a job as an editor of the Albuquerque Daily Democrat. But his income remained meager, so Ross worked long hours as a typesetter at the Morning Journal. An El Paso journalist wrote that he often saw Ross working as a substitute through long nights for little pay.
And as a newspaper man, he quickly became acquainted with the unsavory reputation of the Santa Fe Ring, and as a Democrat and a person of strong ethics, he disapproved.
On May 20th, 1885, William S. Burke, a former editor of the territory's leading Republican paper, wrote a letter to President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, expressing his support for Ross as territorial governor. Less than a week later, it was announced that the president made the appointment. Men, women, and children of every station and degree of life, as is found in Albuquerque, crowded on the platform, waiting to give a cordial welcome to Governor Ross. Ross believed strongly that many of the territory's ills could be addressed by achieving statehood that had been denied New Mexico twice before. He was especially concerned about the lack of a formal education system and the rampant corruption in Santa Fe. Ross took office in the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. At the time, an estimated 24,000 square miles of the territory, equivalent to the size of Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Vermont combined. He soon openly criticized the rampant corruption he saw in Santa Fe by the Santa Fe Ring, a group that dominated business, ranching, mining, and government in the territory.
There was a contractor group of those who supplied cattle to forts and Indian reservations, and there were ways of gaming that by overcounting Indian populations that were served and by delivering inferior grain, inferior cattle, misweighing cattle. A good many Spanish and Mexican families who had been settled on land grants for multiple generations were severely and adversely impacted. Their property interests were committed to be protected under provisions of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but that did not happen.
When people shall have forever buried out of sight that gang that perpetuated these infamies, New Mexico will be ready for statehood, but not so long as they are above ground. We desire statehood as earnestly as anybody, but prefer to wait till there can be no further danger from this source.
Throughout Ross's tenure, there was simply open conflict between the governor and the Ring.
He vetoed legislation when he thought pending bills favored those powerful interests or gave unfair advantage to one segment of the population over another.
One bill that he vetoed had to do with prohibiting the entry of women into saloons. Ross made a point of saying that any occupation that is suitable for a man is also suitable for a woman, and any occupation that's dishonorable for a woman is also dishonorable for a man.
He also fought for an equitable system of land ownership arguing before the U.S. Congress for the establishment of a court of private land claims, which finally became law in 1891. In his December 29, 1888 message to the legislature, Ross argued passionately for a statewide education system.
Probably the most significant accomplishment of Ross's terms was the establishment of the Agricultural University at Las Cruces, the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and the School of Mines in Socorro. It was a great disappointment to Ross that he was unable to secure agreement on a public school bill, which was badly needed if New Mexico was to attain its ambition of attaining statehood. But that did not occur.
After his term expired, Ross alternately worked as a printer and editor and as secretary of the Bureau of Immigration in Santa Fe. He continued to be an unrelenting critic of the Santa Fe Ring. He acquired a parcel of land south of Albuquerque on which his son built a 12 by 14-foot shanty that was later enlarged to include a kitchen. Ross spent many of his remaining years in this little house that would become a favorite family gathering place. He devoted his days to writing about his experiences in government, and in 1896 completed a major work titled History of the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson, President of the United States.
If the Johnson had been impeached, it would have meant that the Congress would have become more dominant than the executive, which I think we want equal branches, not one where the Congress is the strongest. So that I think that Ross made a great contribution to our system and at his own personal loss.
Finances continued to plague him, however, as they did through most of his life. In 1897, he told his daughter Lillian,
"I have nothing in view now, but I'm sure that something will turn up for me before many months."
But it is doubtful he was ever employed again. His children moved him to a house on Bareilles Road with a couple of acres of land and fruit trees. He loved the old adobe and took long walks and sawed firewood for exercise, although a war injury had diminished his strength in one arm.
He would carry in an armful, fill up the stove, draw up his chair, and watch the glow with great satisfaction.
At the end of his working career, after all of the slings and arrows that he had suffered as a result of doing the right thing, Ross just never lost the innate sense of goodwill and good spirit that had been his throughout his life. He never lost track of who he was or what he stood for.
My father said that when he was a small boy, probably 1893, his mother called him to the window. She said, "Governor Ross is walking by. He's a very famous man. I want you to remember him."
Then a remarkable thing occurred. An old friend from Kansas days appeared. General Hugh Cameron had served with Ross in the 2nd Kansas Cavalry. Cameron had come to New Mexico on a mission to make it plain that Ross had finally been vindicated by the people of Kansas. It is said that years earlier, Cameron had withdrawn from society, becoming somewhat of a hermit as a protest for the disgraceful way Kansans had treated Ross. Once in New Mexico, Cameron showed Ross numerous newspaper clippings, letters, and various documents containing tributes to Ross, including a resolution by the Kansas legislature.
Resolved that we commend and approve the mission to the Honorable Edmund Gibson Ross with the most universal approval of his vote, which saved the state and nation from disgrace, and that we send to him our cordial invitation to return to the state and enjoy the distinction brought about by said vote.
During the Cameron visit, Ross enjoyed a horseless carriage ride around town with Cameron and his old friend Elias Stover. Among their destinations was a major public reception in their honor.
Father enjoyed the music, applauding heartily, but as to the congratulatory speeches, he comprehended little. For his own gratification, the turning point of the tide of public opinion had come too late. He once told me, "I'll be a bigger man dead than I have ever been living."
Edmund G. Ross passed away on May 8, 1907, at the age of 80. The Albuquerque Press called his life one of the most remarkable careers of the century.
Thus ended the saga of a man who devoted his life to seeking freedom and equality for all men and women, who led a wagon train to Kansas and fought to keep the emerging West free of slavery, who commanded hundreds of troops and served heroically in the war to free the slaves, who cast the crucial Senate vote to save a president, thereby preserving our system of government, and who battled corruption in New Mexico, working tirelessly to protect citizens' land rights and to establish a territory-wide system of education. Members of the Grand Army of the Republic and other mourners made the long, dusty trek to his interment in Fairview Cemetery in Albuquerque, described later by John F. Kennedy as a lonely grave, forgotten and unknown. He had died a poor man who stayed true to his principles and the strength of his convictions. His life, indeed, a profile in courage.